Welcome to the California Sun Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. In a world where noise often drowns out meaning, where tweets and sound bites dominate our discourse, and where the constant barrage of information leaves little room for reflection, the art of listening has become more crucial than ever. Our society's cacophony of voices, opinions, and distractions has created a paradox. We're more connected than ever, yet genuine communication seems increasingly elusive. My guest today, Berkeley author Elizabeth Rosner, shares her new work, Third Ear, Reflections on the Art and Science of Listening. She invites us to explore the profound impact of truly hearing, not just with our ears, but with our hearts and minds. In an age where everyone seems to be shouting, Rosner argues that it is those who master the art of listening who will shape the future, a future that may very well begin right here in California. Elizabeth Rosner weaves her personal experiences as a child of Holocaust survivors with cutting-edge research on interspecies communications. She explores how deep listening can enhance our empathy, curiosity, and connection to the world around us. She points out that listening is a transformative act, one that has the potential to heal individuals and bridge the divides that threaten to tear us apart. In a time when we're quick to speak and slow to listen, she reminds us of the power and necessity of true dialogue. Elizabeth Rosner is a best-selling novelist, poet, and essayist. Her previous book, Survivor Cafe, was awarded numerous prizes, and her novel Electric City was named one of the best books by NPR. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Elle, and numerous anthologies, and it is my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Rosner here to talk about Third Ear, Reflections on the Art and Science of Listening. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us here on the California Sun Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on your show, Jeff.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. Is there some kind of relationship between the amount of that we hear, the amount of noise that exists out there, and our ability to listen?
Oh, I think so. And I'm not the only one who thinks so, for sure. I actually think there are quite a few people joining me in this notion of how hard it is to really focus our attention. It's more and more challenging. We're all pretty much overstimulated all the time by incoming information, whether it's just notifications on your phone, those ubiquitous little sounds that our devices make, or just the awareness that we have of what's going on in the public sphere. A lot of people are wanting to be heard, and it's harder and harder to pay attention.
In many ways, it seems that we haven't evolved as human beings in terms of our ability to listen, that we haven't evolved nearly as fast as all the things coming at us.
That's a really interesting point. I think that, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so I can't really address that from an expert point of view, but I can say that given the research that I did for this book, we are evolved to tune into certain sounds, especially when we're younger, like when we're of parenting age, let's say. We are very wired to hear certain high-pitched sounds, for example, that might sound like a baby in distress, an infant who needs our attention. And so that frequency, those high tones, we start to hear less and less as we age. And the research says that's because it's not as urgent for us. But what that means is that our bandwidth kind of shrinks over time. And so I think, you can use that as a metaphor if you want to. I do choose to see it metaphorically that our range, our exposure, even though we keep wanting maybe to widen it, it's actually shrinking. And so we have to make efforts to point our attention, to kind of try and filter out the things that aren't as essential and see if we can bring more deep and deliberate attention to the things that are important.
And what role does language itself play in that? You talk a lot about language and that you grew up in a household where 6 languages were spoken.
Yeah, I really, in many ways, this book grew out of my remembering and reflecting on what my childhood had been like in terms of sound, in terms of what I was trying to tune into and when I didn't feel maybe well listened to myself. And it really strangely, belatedly dawned on me that of all the languages that were being spoken in my household, my mother spoke seven, my father shared three of those with her. But among two out of those three languages were languages I never knew and wasn't supposed to know, German being one of them. My father's native tongue was a language that my mother acquired, but they considered that the forbidden language. It was for shorthand for them as Holocaust survivors, they referred to it as the language of the murderers. So we kids were forbidden to study it, never allowed to speak it in the home. And yet, from time to time, I would hear my father speaking it with his brother in Israel. Then there was Swedish. My parents had met as refugees after the end of the war in Sweden. Sweden, not a native language to either one of them, Swedish was the language that they fell in love speaking. And then there were my mother's two mother tongues, Polish and Russian. She was born in Vilna, Lithuania, and nobody but her spoke those two. So English was our common language, but then there were all these other sounds floating around and sort of I was bumping up against the edges of them. And I kept on wanting to know what was being said when things were being whispered or things were being hidden.
And what role does your research tell you that multilingual ability, what role does that play in the way we listen, the way we understand?
Well, there's some really exciting and I think important research being done about the multilingual brain. And one of the things I learned, because I had a really interesting interview with a woman named Viorica Marian, who's a neurolinguistics specialist. And she explained that even if you're only, and I say only kind of with quotation marks around it, even if you're only bilingual, your cognitive ability, your decision-making ability, they call it your executive function, is more acute and more responsive than people who only speak one language. Because one of the things your brain is constantly doing is selecting which vocabulary do I speak in this moment, which requirement language is necessary with this particular person. If you have a parent who speaks one language and another parent speaking another, even as a child, you're already practicing that kind of discernment. And what they're not sure about yet, and again, I'm not an expert here. I'm a gatherer of information. They aren't sure if more than two languages, exponentially increases those abilities. But for sure, even just having more than one is really good for your brain health. It's really good for your cognitive abilities. And so, unfortunately for me, I actually didn't learn any of my mother's languages. I studied Spanish in school. And, I kind of jokingly say now that I speak one and a half languages. I want to call myself bilingual, but I'm really not. But I do feel like that early exposure in my childhood to those sounds did intensify my ability to pay a lot of careful attention to what people were saying.
And with respect to paying attention, talk about this idea of deep listening and what that means.
So the irony for me is that even though I feel like I was really tuned in to what was being said and what was being hidden, I also had a certain kind of existential loneliness, I think, in my childhood. And so I was spending a lot of time out in nature. I was in the woods a lot. During summers, I was in the water a lot as much as possible. Often I liked really being underwater. I loved being with animals, especially horses and dogs. There were some stables near where I lived in upstate New York. And I think without even knowing that's what I was doing, I was in many ways training myself to get very quiet and and to feel my way into what I would now call and what other people call the soundscape around me. And what that did was really console and comfort me. I think my loneliness was such that I was looking for ways to feel connected. And it didn't necessarily have to be other people that I felt connected to. It had to be the world. I had to feel like I was a part of something bigger than myself.
How much difference does it make the form in which we're listening, whether it's interpersonal, two people sitting across from each other, or whether it's a conversation over the telephone or over Zoom or over some other electronic device? What relevance does the method of communicating have to how we listen?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question. So here I'm sitting with you over Zoom, but we have our cameras turned off, which for me, I got to say, thank you for that. Because I'm very easily, probably like a lot of people, I'm very distracted by what's in my visual field. So the strangest thing for me about Zoom is that I know we can modify slightly these features, but basically, there's something to me completely bizarre about watching myself talk to somebody. So I am much better at listening to you and being authentic and fully present with you when my eyes are. I mean, I'm looking out the window right now of my house, and there are beautiful trees, and there are some flowers on the table in front of me. But I have a kind of a soft gaze toward those because really I'm trying to focus on my other senses. And so I do think that our senses can sometimes compete against each other. And one of the things I learned in my research too is that we tend to modify the focus of our listening depending on what we're looking at. Like if we're at the ocean and we're looking down at our feet, we're more likely to tune into the sound of the surf than if we're looking out at the horizon. We're more likely to actually hear the movement of wind, waves, and maybe people out in the far water. So that fascinates me, that interconnectedness between, for example, our visual field and our auditory field.
And in many cases, people are at the beach and maybe hearing some of this, but they're also looking down at their phones and doing something else.
Right. And so that's what I was talking about at the beginning of our conversation, this way in which we may not even consciously know it, but we are sacrificing our attention a lot when we're multitasking. I mean, maybe people think this is obvious. It is sort of obvious, but I think the loss, somehow people decide, oh, well, it's okay. It doesn't matter because I prefer to multitask. I'm being more efficient with my time. But really what's happening is you're crowding out your deeper absorption of what's being said, what's being implied. We think a lot about the content of what somebody might be sharing with us, but what about the tone? What about their body language? What about the pauses in between what they're saying? Anna Devere Smith, who's one of my heroes. She's just, I would call her a super listener. I'm sure she wouldn't call herself that. She's very modest, but she talks about her work as a performer, as an interviewer, as a theater writer, a playwright, that she's listening for the melody of what people are saying, and she'll notice when that melody shifts, and that's a place where they're dropping into something important. And I don't know, maybe you heard that in my voice just then. I could feel it. I was changing my rhythm a little bit. I was lowering my voice a little bit. And so all these subtleties and nuance, we are likely to be missing if we're only paying half attention to someone. And I honestly believe, because the book really isn't only about interpersonal conversation and connection, I believe that we're missing all those opportunities with the world. And I don't just mean the human world, birds, the, buzzing of insects, the movement of trees in the wind, other beings that are maybe hidden from view, but are in our ecosystem. If we can get quieter, we can hear so much more.
I want to come back to the interpersonal for a minute. The other place where it has an impact is on the content itself, because the way in which somebody speaks, the way in which they communicate with somebody else, is often directly impacted by their perception of the degree to which the person they're talking to is listening or not.
Right. I know that for me, if I'm feeling like the person I'm in conversation with is only half present, or is, maybe they're looking over my shoulder rather than into my eyes, or maybe I see them kind of glancing down at their phone, or I don't know, just something tells me they're more waiting for their turn to speak than really taking in what I'm saying. That might shut me down or at least make me abbreviate what I'm saying. And, sometimes I'll actually check in with that person and I'll just stop and I'll say, um, is something going on? Or is there something you're wanting to say that, makes you want to jump in? So, or they might have already jumped in and shut me down. So I think part of our communication strategies also include or can include checking in with the person. Did you just hear me? And I know this is, there are all kinds of people who study and practice things they call active listening, where you play back what you just heard and you let the person know, here's what I heard. And so those, sometimes feel very strategic and very, they can feel contrived. But I think in more casual, informal settings, you can just watch and wait, and your body will sometimes tell you if you're feeling listened to or not.
And talking about the way your body tells you, talk a bit about this concept of the third ear.
Mm. Well, I came across it initially when I was doing some research into Freudian analysis, and I was actually working on a different book altogether. I was writing a novel at the time, and I wanted to kind of refresh my memory or deepen my understanding about Freudian analysis. And I came across this reference to one of Freud's proteges, Theodore Reich, who wrote a book called Listening with the Third Ear. And I just, immediately felt my curiosity piqued. And I started kind of tracking, going down a rabbit hole, as we say in the research world, of what did he mean by that? What was he doing as a he in some ways is credited with being the originator of psychotherapy, moving away from psychoanalysis as a medical model, as a very analytic model in which the analyst says nothing and is, in the Freudian sense, trying to just be neutral with attention. Reich believed that there was a way to be present with your patient, your client. He didn't use the word client, he would have said patient or analysand. Um, and you're not just listening to what they say, you're listening to what they don't say. And you've also got your listening skill turned inward. You're listening inside yourself for your responses to what they're saying. And that really isn't what Freud was doing at all. So Reich was actually reaching more toward an empathic connection. And that's when I started to get really excited about how that might be relevant to us today. And certainly to me, what are all my strategies for listening that aren't just relying on my ears, but how I feel, what I notice? Did I hold my breath just then? Do I feel an ache in my chest? Do I feel like I want to cry? Sometimes, even with my writing students, when we read to each other in small groups, I'll notice if I'm leaning toward the person who's reading something. Do I feel even more like I want to get physically closer to them? To me, those are all aspects of what I call third ear listening.
It really is about, I mean, psychotherapy being, I guess, the penultimate example, but that connection between two people or groups of people,
Mhm.
having a conversation where there's genuine connection as opposed to just playing tennis. One person talks, the next person talks, the
Mhm.
next person talks, and there isn't a connection.
Right. I think a lot of people have come to believe that that's just normal, that everybody takes a turn, and while you're waiting for your turn, you're thinking about what you're going to say, and maybe 20% of your attention is on what other people are saying before it's your turn. And that's just a made up number, that percentage, but it takes actual effort to undo that habit, I think, and to decide, no, I'm going to trust that when it's my turn, I'll be able to be present fully with myself and my thoughts because I'm being fully present with these other people now. And when I teach that to my writing groups, one of the benefits of that is actually you get less nervous about your turn, right? There's no room left for you to be spinning and anxiously wondering if you're going to be clear, if you're going to be understood. You use all of your attention to focus on somebody else. And actually, it calms your nervous system. It makes you receptive, it relaxes you, and it makes you feel connected. And then when it's your turn, you come from that place.
There's also a way that that is somehow connected to kind of a creative process that comes out of that dialogue.
Yeah, I know for myself, I am at my best when I've gotten deeply centered. And even as a writer, when I think that I'm creating from my smartest brain, I'm actually maybe overthinking or I'm straining to be clever or write something beautiful. Whereas if I actually open to the moment in that fullest, deepest, quietest, spacious place, the best work comes through me and it's not effortful. It's actually, I don't know, it's I dare I say more sacred, more pure. In the book I do talk about this as a kind of spiritual practice, even though this isn't a how-to book, and I'm not trying to give other people instructions about how to do things. I'm just really trying to explore and describe what I've learned and what I've experienced in terms of my own evolution as a listener.
And when you look at, and you talk about this in the book, the idea of interspecies communication, what do we learn from that?
Well, again, I feel like there's this explosion right now of books and podcasts and TED Talks and, a lot in the media about the languages and communication styles of other species around us, whether it's mammals with whom we share a lot of anatomical structure and also evolutionary history, but also with beings that we would have thought would not be like us at all, insects, trees, um, what's happening underneath the soil, what's happening among the roots of trees, how are they speaking to one another? The way that those networks share information, protect each other, nourish each other, guard against invasive species. I'm talking now about the mycelium layer of the soil. I'm talking about networked trees in the forest and in large, large open spaces. I think what we can learn about those things as human beings is that our capacity for communal interaction, to recognize that we're not as separate as we appear, is of great benefit to us as a species, to really notice how are these other beings in the world showing us and demonstrating their care for one another and their guardianship of one another. I think it's really it's almost our only hope, I think. I don't mean to sound catastrophic and dire, but I think there's a lot of urgent need for us to learn these things now.
And should we be thinking about them on a small scale, on a very personal scale, or should we be thinking about it on a global scale as well, on a much larger frame?
Well, honestly, even though you posed it as an either or question, I don't believe that either or thinking is going to help us so much right now. I think that we have to do both and. And again, I am not the only voice out there offering this suggestion. I think that in a lot of ways, these are really ancient practices and ancient sources of wisdom from indigenous cultures way, way back that individuals are part of something larger, whether it's our tribe, our community, the bigger, ecosphere, ecosystem, Gaia consciousness. All of these things demand of us that we think of ourselves as part of something bigger, but that doesn't, in my view, exclude also focusing on myself as a self. So I can do my inner practicing, I can sit quietly and meditate and feel connected, feel that I am both with myself as a separate being and not so separate. So I think, at least for me, the the binary thinking, or the thing that, oh, I have to completely dissolve and disappear in order to be part of something bigger, doesn't work for me so much, as then I start to just lose track of like what and who I'm here to be. So I think it's both and.
I guess the flip side of that, the negative side of that, and there's probably way too much of this going on in society today, is people feeling that it's more important for them to say what it is they want to say, no matter what it is, more important for them to speak than for anybody else to even be listening to them.
Yeah, and again, it's so obvious if you listen to the news for 30 seconds, how much of that is going on. That there's this demanding that people agree with me, or buy into my view of the world, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you and you need to check your bias. And and I understand that feeling of agitation. There's a lot of fear and I feel it too. There's a lot of pretty amped up nervousness about where we as a culture are headed, where we as a nation are headed, where we as a species are headed. And yet, I think the louder I want to shout, the more I have to notice that that is coming from my fear, and that is not going to serve me in terms of being heard. So I need to work on my volume control. I need to try to calm myself down. In all kinds of therapies, they talk about developing the skill of self-soothing, or noticing, oh, this is my trauma stirred up now. So I got to manage that before I can really calmly express myself. And then the other piece of that is that allows me to get more curious. Where are you coming from? What is your belief system? What are you attached to as the absolute right view? And rather than try and talk you out of that, I need to start by understanding you. I need to start by asking you some more questions. What do you feel? What do you believe? And the more I understand you, the more we are actually connecting and sharing, rather than trying to beat each other up and have a win-lose scenario.
We need a societal kind of mass psychotherapy, I think.
Oh my gosh, I totally agree with that. I do, but unlike, the old time method of, years on the couch, we don't have time for that. So I think we've really got to develop strategies that are way more immediate than that. And again, to say I am not here to preach, or offer up my guidance as the ultimate approach, but just encourage people to think about, what have you experienced in a moment of listening that really allowed you to feel heard? What was that like for you? How can you cultivate that more?
Elizabeth Rosner, her book is Third Year Reflections on the Art and Science of Listening. Elizabeth, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
It's been my great pleasure, Jeff. I so appreciate your listening style. You're really good at this.
Thank you very much. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the California Sun podcast. I hope you'll join us next week. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.